Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. Today I thought I would make a video recommending some books that you might enjoy reading for LGBT History Month. So in the UK, LGBT History Month is the month of February. So I thought I would recommend today a few books suited to that month, books that are connected to the history of LGBT people or LGBT rights. This video is going to be a slightly eclectic selection of books. The majority of books I want to recommend today are historical fiction novels that feature queer characters, which is something I really enjoy in historical fiction, partly because, as I've talked about before, as someone who reads a lot of classics, if I read a book set in the 19th century that wasn't written in the 19th century, for me it needs to include something that you don't get in books that were written in the 19th century, such as a very distinctive, unusual structure or writing style that you wouldn't have got in the 19th century, or examination of groups of people that weren't explored very much in 19th century literature. So, I started making a list for this video of historical fiction with queer characters, and there's some brilliant books that I want to talk about today. But then I also thought of a few other books that I wanted to mention that I felt like I couldn't make this video without mentioning. One is a non-fiction and the other two are early 20th century classics that look at sexuality. If you would like to hear me talk about LGBTQ plus themes and like undertones in Victorian literature, I made a video on that about a year and a half ago for Victober, which I will link down below, so I'm not going to talk about any Victorian literature here, though there is plenty of subtext in Victorian literature if you look for it. Another reason why this video will be slightly bitty is because two of the historical fiction novels that I really want to talk about and I really want to recommend are two books where it doesn't become clear that the book looks at kind of LGBT history. It doesn't become clear that any of the characters are gay until quite a long way through the book, and I feel like it's a slight spoiler to talk about them in this video. I remember once seeing a video on BookTube where someone said that they didn't think a character's sexuality could ever be a spoiler, but I think I disagree with that, especially when it comes to historical fiction, which often play with like tropes and expectations of literature from that time. So there are these two books that I really want to discuss, but I also feel like it might be a slight spoiler to discuss. But then some people aren't that fussy about spoilers. So I think what I will do is I will save those books till the end, and if you're someone who doesn't care about spoilers, feel free to watch right to the end. If you're someone who's a bit wary of that, feel free to stop at that point. I will also, when I link to the Goodreads pages down in the description, I'll just put like last book 1, last book 2, and I will make sure the link is a tiny URL so it doesn't have the name in. I mean, not that you probably care enough to look there, but that will make me feel like I haven't spoiled books for you. But also if you don't care about such things and would like to watch on to the end of the video, do, because they're two amazing books that I really want to talk about. So yes, anyway, that was a long enough introduction onto the books. The first book I want to mention today is this. This is a non-fiction book called SameSex Love, 1700 to 1957, a history and research guide by Jill Rossini. This is a book I read about a year and a half ago now, maybe just slightly over that, and it's absolutely fantastic. It is published by Pen and Sword, who very kindly sent me a review copy at the time, and it is pretty short. Like, this won't take you very long, but it's so comprehensive for such a small book, and it's so interesting, so deep, and so fascinating to read, and she really powerfully and movingly and interestingly, with tons of primary sources as well as secondary sources, writes about the history of LGBTQ people from 1700 to the 50s, and I just think it's a really wonderful, powerful read. Definitely one I would recommend. Really accessible, really easy to read, not too academic, not too long, and just, yeah, really interesting to read if you want to this LGBT History Month. And then, as I said, I have two early 20th century classics I want to recommend. The first is Maurice by Ian Forster. This was one of my favourite books of 2018, and it's absolutely brilliant. It was written in the 1910s, though it wasn't published until after Ian Forster's death in 1970, and it is really powerful. Ian Forster was gay, and this is the only one of his many novels that deals explicitly with homosexuality and looks at what it was like being gay in the Edwardian period and all of the worry and fear and doubt and ostracisation that came with that. I think there are two things in this book I found so powerful. One is the kind of worry that Maurice, this character, feels throughout the book, knowing that he's attracted to men. That for so much of this book he just thinks there's something wrong with him and he just wishes he were like everybody else, and it's really moving and awful. And the other thing that I found really powerful and interesting in this book is the fear of blackmail. Like in the 1910s and before, when it was illegal for men to have relationships and when you would have been ostracised even if you weren't arrested, the fear of blackmail and not being able to trust people you have relationships with is so interesting and powerful, and it's just brilliant. This book made me weep a lot, and it's partly really powerful, I think, because it's quite raw, and a lot of it you can tell it's from sort of Ian Forster's experience, or even just like the fact that this book is dedicated to a happier year, and even though we still have a long way to go, I think it's a happier year, right? Anyway, it's fantastic, you must read. And then the other early 20th century classic I would like to recommend is Albert Nobbs by George Moore. This is a really interesting novella and one I would recommend. I think it's really interesting in terms of looking at early 20th century explorations and ideas about gender and sexuality and gender identity. And I know there was also a film made of it a few years ago, which I'd be quite interested to see, because I imagine it extends some things and changes some things, but I think it would be quite interesting. But basically, the novella follows somebody called Albert Nobbs, who works in a hotel, who presents and has lived their life as a man, but one of the characters discovers fairly early on in the book that Albert Nobbs is biologically a woman who originally started dressing and living as a man in order to earn more money, but now has lived as a man so long that kind of considers himself to be a man. And then we kind of, over the course of the novella, follow Albert's kind of desire to marry a woman, and kind of things go on from there. One thing that is quite unclear from a modern perspective, though obviously these weren't the terms that would have been used at the time, is whether Albert Nobbs is a transgender man or a lesbian woman who lives and dresses as a man in order to earn more money. Either way, it's really, really interesting in terms of LGBT history and the history of gender identity. And considering it was written in 1927, it's just really, really interesting. So that's those three books. Now on to the historical fiction. First, I want to recommend Days Without End by Sebastian Barry. This was one of my favourite books of 2018 and is a really, really wonderful read. It follows two men, John and Thomas, who meet in mid-19th century America. They are soldiers together in the Indian Wars and the Civil Wars, and they also form a relationship and later adopt a Native American girl. And the way this book looks at kind of family and relationships and the love between John and Thomas that they always have to hide, but is always so important to them, and the way they kind of create a family, it's so interesting, and it looks at kind of masculinity and sexuality in so many interesting ways. I just highly recommend it. It is a beautiful, moving and powerful book with such a strong love story at its heart. Next, I could not make this video without talking about Sarah Waters. Here I have Fingersmith and Tipping the Velvet, which are the two books of hers that I've read, though I'm hoping to read everything by her. She is an amazing writer who writes wonderfully about the Victorian period, and especially, at least in these two books, I haven't read the rest of her, about kind of Victorian lesbianism and Victorian sexuality and gender identity. These books are both so good. Fingersmith is incredibly twisty and turny. It's about a young woman called Sue who has been brought up as a thief, and in a kind of conspiracy theory way ends up working as a lady's maid for a wealthy family in order to try and trick another young woman out of her money. Except for, of course, that she then starts to fall for that young woman, and then everything goes completely mad. The plotting is insane and wonderful, and I just love it so much. Tipping the Velvet is my favourite Sarah Waters that I've read so far, and it's really, really incredible. We follow Nan, who, at the very beginning of the book, develops a crush on a local music hall star called Kitty, who is a female singer who performs dressed as a man. And this crush and friendship leads Nan into a whole new world. The way this book looks at gender as well as sexuality is really, really interesting. And the way that it kind of looks at like lesbian subculture within Victorian culture is really, really interesting too. Definitely a book I would recommend. Next, I want to recommend A Place Called Winter by Patrick Gale. This is a wonderful novel set in the Edwardian period and later, following a man called Harry Kane. Shortly after Harry Kane's marriage, he meets a man who makes him question his sexuality and his life choices, and this kind of develops into a scandal which leads to Harry fleeing Edwardian England and going abroad to Canada to make a new life for himself. This book is wonderfully rich, it's so moving, it's so powerful. The way it looks at sexuality and gender and family as well, like the way this book looks at family and friendship is so good too. I love it. It was so compelling and enjoyable and powerful, and I cannot recommend it enough. Next, I want to mention The Rain Before It Falls by Jonathan Coe. This is a book that I read several years ago. It's a pre-booktube book, but it's one that I absolutely adored and one that I really wanted to recommend because it's really powerful, really interesting, and it's one that I really, really must reread sometime because it just has so many things I love in it, and it's been too long since I read this book, so I also need to read more by Jonathan Coe, but that's for another time. The Rain Before It Falls tells the story of several different generations of women, but one of the women who narrates a lot of this book is called Rosamond. It looks at her life in the mid-20th century, being a gay woman at that time, what it was like, her relationships and dynamics, and her efforts to build a family in an unconventional way. It's so powerful and moving, and I can't wait to reread it sometime because it really has been too long since I read it, and I think it's a beautiful, beautiful novel. I would also recommend it as a good place to start with Jonathan Coe because it is not very political, and some of his other stuff is very much more political, whereas this is just a beautiful literary fiction novel examination of family and love, and I just can't recommend it enough. Next, I have two novels that are not entirely historical, but are a little bit historical in places, and both of these look very interestingly and very movingly at the 1980s AIDS crisis. One is Tinman by Sarah Winman. Now, this is a book that's been around on BookTube a lot, and I read it and I quite liked it, but I wasn't especially fussed. But it stayed with me much more than I thought it would, and actually it's a book that I think about quite a lot, considering that I didn't consider it one of my favourite books at the time. So it is one that I would really recommend. One, because a lot of people loved it and were much more emotionally engaged with it than me, and also because it's a book that my emotional engagement with has kind of grown over time since I've read it, rather than the other way around. But Tinman tells the story of two men who are sort of friends and almost something more as teenagers, and then kind of into their adult life. The book looks very interestingly at these two boys kind of discovering their sexualities in a time when their sexualities weren't necessarily considered acceptable. And there's also the second half of the book looks really powerfully and movingly at the AIDS crisis as well. And the other book I want to mention, which deals with similar themes, is The Immortals by Chloe Benjamin. This is a book I read last year and really enjoyed. Now, I'm only really talking about the first 25% of this book in here. The book is divided into four and tells the story of four siblings, very, very different stories. And the first quarter of this book, the first sibling story, Simon, that was my favourite section of the whole book. That was the bit I loved the most, and it tells the story of Simon being a teenager in the 1980s, moving away from his conventional conservative family to live in San Francisco and finding love. And it's so powerful and emotive, and it also looks very movingly at kind of the spread of AIDS in the 1980s. I just would really, really recommend The Immortalist. Like, the whole book is good, but that first quarter was the best bit of the book and is fantastic, and I would recommend reading the book just for that section in a way. So that is it for the books that I can talk about with no hint of spoilers. I have two more books I want to talk about, as I said, which are so brilliant, and I really want to recommend here because they're fantastic, fascinating books to read in terms of representation of LGBT characters in historical fiction and in terms of LGBT history. But it's also, like I said, they're books where it's not clear till a third, a half, more of the way through that particular characters in them are queer. So if you're afraid of spoilers, go now. If you're not too fussed, stay. Now on to the last two books. Firstly, I want to recommend The Minute Tryst by Jessie Burton. This book is set in 17th century Amsterdam. As I'm trying to not be too spoilery here, I'm not going to talk about which characters in this book may or may not be queer, but this book looks really fascinatingly at the way gay people were treated at this time, and about a way that homosexuality and kind of sexuality in general was perceived at this time. It's so interesting, it's so powerful, it's such a fantastic book. I loved this so, so, so much, and I think that element of the book and the kind of LGBT characters in it was just so good, and I would really, really recommend this. And next I have The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, which is my favourite book of 2018, and I love this book for many, many reasons, but the love story in this book just makes me want to weep a little bit. Like, it's so good, it's so fantastic, and I think it is one of the best queer love stories I've read in historical fiction, or just ever, or just one of the best love stories I've read in all of literature, and I loved it. I love this book so, so, so much. Again, trying not to be spoilery, won't say too much more than that, but this book is set in late 19th century London, and it follows various characters, but you really, really must read this book if you haven't, because it's just amazing. So that is it. Those are the books that I wanted to recommend for LGBT History Month. Obviously, nearly all of these are fictional, so they're not necessarily the best places to get your facts about LGBT history, but I think if you are interested in LGBT history, actually historical fiction is often a really good way to kind of get your teeth into learning about attitudes in the past and things like that. And also, it's just really enjoyable and interesting to read as well. So that is all for today. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments if you have any other historical fiction to recommend with LGBTQ+ characters, because that is something I love in historical fiction and would definitely like to read more of. And that is all. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.